Afternoon, evening, everyone. My name is Matt Lassiter. I'm the co-director of the Carceral State Project at the University of Michigan with Heather Thompson, who's here on the fourth-ish row. And we have been launching a new project documenting the history of juvenile life without parole and providing expert witness testimony for some cases with the State Appellate Defender's Office. And as I got into that project more, I realized that Deborah LaBelle, who you're going to hear from first, has already done all of this herself. And you're going to hear from a lot of activists, legislators, and others who have been really working on this issue. And I'm going to give just a very brief overview because I think Deb's going to tell us some about the history. But Michigan has 363 juveniles serving life without parole when the Supreme Court Miller decision came down in 2012. The Supreme Court didn't start this reform initiative. It was responding to work done by a lot of people, including people on this panel. And there's a lot of resistance in Michigan, especially among prosecutors. And it's been a kind of winding road, and I think we'll hear about a lot of that from the panel. And so I'm going to introduce the panelists right before they speak instead of all at once. And I'll also want to say that Jose Burgos has brought some materials. You can see them on the piano and here on the front row if you want to grab a packet about the campaign for the fair sentencing of youth and their activism. So please grab one of those before you leave. Okay, so we're going to ask each panelist to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we should have plenty of time. Even if they go over, which is, okay, it usually happens, we should still have plenty of time for some questions and discussion from the audience. So first up, we're going to hear from Deborah LaBelle. She's the director of the ACLU's Juvenile Life Without Parole initiative. She's a co-founder of the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. She has been involved in a pretty amazing number of class action lawsuits in a whole broad range of areas in the state of Michigan, and including the Hill versus Whitmer case that led to a settlement recently around the juvenile life without parole issue. And she's also the co-author of two major reports, one called Second Chances, really setting the landscape of juvenile serving life without parole in Michigan prisons, that came out in 2004, and then a follow-up called Basic Decency in 2012. So over to you, Deb.
Okay, thanks. How's this?
You need to turn it on. Oh, you got it.
Okay, how's this work?
Perfect.
Okay. Since I think I'm the setup person, since I was in the beginning, which has now been about 14 years ago. About 14 years ago, there was a group of us that got together, and we were fretting about increased incarceration. We were talking about how our country doesn't treat children consistent with their status. We were talking about racial inequities. And it was a broad-based discussion stemming from the human rights violations that were very deep in this country with regard to people of color and children particularly. And so actually I was thinking about this today. So it was a group of 6 of us who went away for a weekend. It was, some of you may know some of them who are much more illustrious than I am. Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Initiative, and there was Ben Jealous, who at the time was head of Amnesty, Alison Parker, head of Human Rights Watch, myself and Bernadine Dorn, who was running the Northwest Children's Center. And over that weekend, we kept coming back to the fact that the feeder program, the most egregious human rights violations, centered around the way that we try to transform children into adults simply by their acts. That in no other situation can you do this. You do something terrible, you're still, even the United States Supreme Court would say, okay, even in the Hamdi case, someone committed a terrorist act. That doesn't take away your American citizenship. You're not transformed based on your act, nor are you transformed into an adult by your acts of the children. And worse than that, didn't even consider all the issues surrounding children and what it meant to be a child and a captive sometimes in your community and in your homes. And so we decided that the real issue was to change the way we thought about children in the United States. And that in order to do that, we had to focus on the worst offense people would think a child could do, which was homicide, and get the courts and get the public and get everyone else to recognize that no matter what you do, you're a child, and that you had to be treated consistent with that status. And that would open up all sorts of things with regard to looking at your environment, looking at how we fail children in our education and our systems of social help, and how children take the brunt of it, but then when they do something, act out, stray, then we punish them and put them away forever, so that we don't have to think about it. And so that was the genesis of challenging juvenile life without parole in this country. At the time, there were 28 states here in DC that had mandatory life without possibility of parole for children. There were 15 additional states that allowed it discretionary. There are almost 3,000 children in the country, in the United States, who were serving this sentence to be imprisoned until you die. And we were the only ones in the world, except for Somalia at the time, that really didn't have a formal state government, and no one was sure exactly what they were doing. And then there were some Palestinian youth who were imprisoned for life. Other than that, it was verboten. It was a violation of every human rights norm and every treaty that the U.S. had signed, even if they did it with reservations. So that was the beginning of the legal challenge, the monitoring report, which became The Rest of Their Lives, which was a joint report by human rights groups to determine who they were. And in Michigan, the first report that was ever issued, which was Second Chances, which Matt talked about. And Michigan was a real focus because it had the second highest number of children in the world serving this sentence. In Michigan, 362 at the time, mandatory life without parole. And it was unique because it went as young as 14. It could have gone younger under our law, but 14 there were 6 14-year-olds. And it was disparate in terms of race, in that 78% were children of color. So after we did Second Chances in Michigan, we started the litigation, as many of you may know, and Kim will talk about. The United States Supreme Court did, in fact, recognize that children were children and could not be treated as adults in the Miller case. Then Michigan dug in its heels, and they said, okay, fine, in the future, but all 362 will serve the sentence till they die. And so we had at the time an Attorney General, Bill Schuette, who rallied a lot of the other states and was the primary author of this argument that these children had done heinous things and they were akin to adults. And they lost that in the Supreme Court again in the Montgomery case. And then what happened in Michigan was very interesting. First, they were very cranky. The prosecutors lost. They didn't like the decisions, and neither did a lot of judges. And so they dug in their heels, and even though the U.S. Supreme Court said only the very rarest of the rare child should be one that should be subject to this, the one that's incorrigible, the fantasy Hannibal Lecter child. I mean, no one had met such a child, but the Supreme Court hypothesized that there was such an evil seed out there. And that child, who was incapable of rehabilitation, incapable of being reformed in any manner whatsoever, could be sentenced to life without parole. But that was a very, and in fact, Justice Sotomayor said, very, very rare child. In Michigan, they came back down and they said, we're going to seek it for almost everybody again. And it depended on your county, but in the majority of counties, 100%. All of these children are the very rarest of the rare. So it was a battlefield here in Michigan and has been since that time. Kim, I know, will talk about how our progressive and thoughtful Michigan Supreme Court changed and saved a lot of lives here in this state. But while we were waiting for that court, we started resentencing youth in Michigan. And one of the things that we have now is that we have, and I think these statistics are pretty important, because we have 180 youth of the 163, maybe 184 as I speak today, who are now out and free. And that is from the resentencing that they were required to be resentenced and looked at. Again, despite the prosecutors wanting life without parole, that you had to take their child status into consideration, the impulsivity, the brain science, the fact that they were caught maybe in environments that weren't of their making and that you couldn't escape, because if you're under a certain age, you run away from home and it's illegal. You're a felon, in terms of a runaway status. And so the choices are limited, and so the courts, with the help of a lot of experts and lawyers, started arguing to the courts, you have to look at where these children are at. And so resentencings began. 180 plus are out now free. There is another 40 that have not yet been resentenced. And this is 10 years down the line. They're still serving a sentence that is cruel and unusual punishment in Michigan. Michigan still leads the way in the highest number of people in the country, in the world, of youth serving the sentence. The 40 that have not yet been resentenced, and then there were originally 30 more sentenced to life without possibility of parole. Of those, there have been many appeals, and they've come back down. But I think that one of the things that we have to remember here is that there have only been 4 states that have sentenced more than 5 youth to LWOP since the Supreme Court said this is a cruel and unusual punishment. And they're Michigan, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi. This is the company we keep these days. And not to put a scourge on the Southern justice system, but it carries its own legacy. And I think that we have now gone in this country, we have gone to, there are 33 states that now either prohibit life without possibility of parole in this country, or have not given it out in a number of years. There are only 12 states, which have issued this punishment in the last 10 years, only 12. And Michigan is leading the way again. Michigan is leading the way both for, in terms of the actual numbers and in terms of the racial disparity, because it just keeps growing. And the last thing I want to talk about before I pass it over is that it's not just that it's, I think, a clearly unusual sentence now. And Michigan's Constitution prohibits cruel or unusual punishment. It's unusual. I mean, it's not done anywhere in the world. We now have over 30 states that prohibit it, and we have very few. We have 40 states almost that do not allow, have not been using it. But it is a deep human rights violation, and it's being imposed in a very arbitrary way in certain counties in the state, geographically different. I mean, you can look at the counties where the youth is at risk, and if the crime had happened 2 miles over in another county, they wouldn't be getting this sentence. And so it's a sentence that I think it's time that we have to get rid of, either legislatively or through the courts, because it's cruel, it's unusual, and I guess I want to say Michigan children are no worse than any other children in the world, but we just treat them that way here.
Thanks. So the next 2 people who we're going to hear for are Detroit. And I want to say some of the students in the room worked on this research project with me, but it used to be before 1988 that only a juvenile court judge could waive a child into the adult system. And the state passed laws in 1988, and then in 1996 they gave prosecutors, elected prosecutors, the ability to do this, and the number increased, not just for life without parole sentences, but for a broad range of alleged offenses committed by juveniles. And we actually went to the state archives and dug up the history of the passage of these laws, and the 88 law was driven by Democrats, not Republicans. 96 law was driven by Republicans, and we interviewed a number of the legislative staffers who were part of this, and they said we knew it was a terrible thing, but there was so much pressure. And when we asked them why Michigan was the worst, they said racism and Detroit, that this was pushed by the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office and Wayne County Democrats who wanted to crack down and control Black Detroit. This is the era of the war on crack and a lot of super predator hysteria. We looked at the Detroit newspapers. They were running articles that said things like, more than half of all homicides in Wayne County are committed by juveniles. And then we actually looked at the data. It was like 12%. It was just lies and super predator mythology. And it was really striking that the Democrats who were really part of driving this through, at least a number of them knew at the time that this was a terrible thing that would have really bad consequences. And a lot of this is in the reports that Double Bell and others have authored that you can go look to as well. So the next we're going to hear from Jose Burgos. Jose will tell you about, I'm going to tell you a life story before you can tell that he was incarcerated for 27 years. He has previously worked for the State Appellate Defender's Office as a reentry specialist, and he has just started a new job as the Michigan campaign coordinator for the campaign for the fair sentencing of youth. So over to you, Jose.
Thank you very much. My name is Jose Burgos. Yes, I'm a former juvenile lifer. I served 27 years from the age of 16 to 43. And I guess I'll just start off and tell you a little bit about my story. At the age, I grew up with my grandparents in southwest Detroit. At the age of 13, I lost my mother to suicide. And it was like literally like within 3 years of that trauma that I had experienced, 3 years later I found myself being charged with first-degree murder. And so when I caught the case, I remember being told that I was facing the possibility of spending the rest of my life in prison. Prior to the crime taking place, I didn't even know that was possible. And even after I was convicted, I still didn't feel that my case warranted that type of sentence. I was a first-time offender. But it happened. It happened. I was sentenced to life without parole. I was also sentenced to an additional 15 to 30 years for additional crimes that took place. And I remember, going to prison at that age, man. I would sit back and there was just something. It just felt like there was just something not right about this sentence. You know what I'm saying? I kind of felt like I didn't know. I felt that I was going to get out. I didn't know how it was going to happen, but I knew it was going to be a long time, right? And so, but once I got into prison, the very same negative environment that I left that got me into prison, was there waiting for me. Prior to the committing of my crime, I was involved in gangs, so that was one of the things that was waiting for me when I went in. And being so young, in an adult environment, you had to get in where you fit in. You had to try to see how you can survive this. I've seen a lot of guys that came in at the same time that I came in. They were also juveniles, man, and they had a very, very hard time because the prison system wasn't created for them in the first place. I remember when I first got there, one of the first things that I wanted to do, I wanted to work at a factory where they had a furniture factory. And I was told that I couldn't work in the furniture factory because it was against child labor laws, right? So, it was crazy. It was like, how can, here I am, I'm old enough to come to this prison, but I can't work at a factory inside a prison because of the child labor laws, you know what I'm saying? So that told me that I wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. And not to say that I shouldn't have been held accountable for my actions. Yes, I was supposed to be held accountable for those crimes. but life without parole wasn't the answer. And too far often, this society, this Michigan and so many other states, it almost feels like they are utilizing children to try to send a message out there to society that, hey, we're being tough on crime, right? I bet you, I don't know the exact numbers, but I'm almost certain that when adults are faced with the same type of charges, adults are probably, juveniles have a higher rate of conviction in first-degree murder than probably a lot of adults do, because juveniles are not able to participate in their own defense. You know, that when I was going through my trial, I just sat there. I didn't know nothing was going on. You know what I'm saying? I sat there, I went through the process, and then here I go, you know, I get sentenced. And so as I go in there, I go in the system, like I said, the same gang that I left on the streets was there when I got in. And I fell right in. I fell right in because I was still making those same, I was a juvenile, I was a kid. You know, so I was still trying to fit in a very, very hostile environment, and I wanted to make sure that I was going to be safe, you know what I'm saying? So I went and got with my crowd, and that was it. But there came a time as I got a little bit older, I just started thinking. I started thinking about what I had done and the impact that my crime had on the families of the victims in my family. And I knew this is not what I wanted for myself. I was telling the story not too long, but around 12 or 13 years into my sentence, I found myself sitting in a segregation cell. All my appeals had been exhausted. I was labeled a gang member, meaning that a lot of privileges, the normal privileges, had been taken away from me. And I found myself in that segregation cell, and I was looking around one day, and I was having a conversation with God, and I was like, God, this can't be it, right? Like, my life cannot end like this, right? And literally, I don't know if this was a sign from God or whatever, but literally 2 weeks after I had that conversation, I got the first letter from Deborah LaBelle, right, from the ACLU, saying that they were doing, an angel from heaven, seriously, that they were doing a study about juvenile lifers, and you know, they were asking if I wanted to participate, and I was like, absolutely. And it was almost like, you know, that little small little light, a little small little hope at the end of that tunnel had finally just opened up for me, right? So as soon as I got out of segregation, the first thing I did was bought me a typewriter, right? I bought me a typewriter, a clear typewriter. I mean, this is old school for real, right? And so I taught myself how to type, and I literally just started typing the letters. I took anybody and everybody I can tell about this juvenile life stuff, right? And so fast forward, you know, I'm involved. I'm going to a law library. I'm learning about the subject. I'm getting familiar with the juvenile life community in every facility that I was at. And in 2012, like Deb was saying, Luther came down. And so, as she mentioned, you know, this was one of the states that fought the retroactivity. So fast forward to 2016, after Montgomery came out, I was one of the cases out of Wayne County where the prosecutor wanted to reinstate the life without parole again, right? By this time, I had been years and years misconduct free. I was involved in every type of possible program, you know, that life could get in, which is not many, but I was able to, you know, work my way and get up in these classes. And so I couldn't understand, at the time, I couldn't understand why it was that they were seeking life without parole again. I felt that I deserved a term of years. So I waited about a year. After a lot of the people who they didn't seek the life without parole on, they went to court, they got resentenced, and I said, you know what, I told my lawyer, I said, hey, let's go back to the prosecutor again and see if we can make this happen, right? So I broke out that same old typewriter that I bought years ago. I typed up a 15-page summary of my case, my life, everything I had in prison, the good, the bad, the ugly, whatever it was. And I sent it to my lawyer and I said, hey, submit this to the prosecutor, don't do nothing to it, just give it to your secretary, have her retype it on the computer or something like that, and let's see what happens. He said, are you sure you want to do this? He said, man, let's just do it. I mean, what else would I have to lose? They've already seen that. 2 weeks later, about 2 or 3 weeks later, I get a letter from my lawyer saying, hey, I just got a call from the prosecutor, they want to sit down and talk to us, right? And so they came with an offer. So they came with an offer of 30 to 60 years. I couldn't believe it, you know what I'm saying? I was optimistic, but I definitely didn't think it was gonna come back that fast, you know what I'm saying? But I got resentenced to 30 to 60 years in 2018. I had already served 27 years, and I had 5 years of disciplinary credits. And so when I saw the parole board, I was immediately released 7 months. Matter of fact, today, 5 years ago today, I got out of prison. So today is my 5th year. One of the things that I told the judge when I went back and got resentenced was that I wanted to come out here, I wanted to be given an opportunity to make something good, you know, come out of something real bad, right? Because I knew that I just didn't, even though I would have been okay with having like a factory job and working because, you know, just being out of prison would have been cool with me. But for me personally, that just wasn't enough, right? It wasn't enough because that life without parole sentence at the age of 16 had that much of an impact on me that I knew that I wanted to come out here. And the only way I knew that things were going to change is for those of us who had experienced it. We had to come out here and voice that no matter how hard that was, right? It's not easy, you know, to come out and get in front of the world and say, hey, these are my faults, this is what I did, this is how much time I did. You know what I'm saying? I mean, that was a very, very traumatic situation that myself went through and many, many, many other kids went through. But I knew that the only way that we were going to get this change was to come out here and say, this is what I want to do, and this is what I'm going to do, right? So I set some goals for myself. One of my first challenges was that for a whole year, I didn't have a birth certificate. So without a birth certificate, you can't get an ID. Without an ID, you can't get a birth certificate. You know what I'm saying? So I ended up getting a job under the table working at a used car dealership, but I knew that wasn't for me. But throughout that year, I started going to events. I started engaged with the juvenile life community that had already been released. I started going to the SATO workshops that they do there for those coming home from prison. And just really started getting in it and just caught that bug. And like, this is it. This is it. I found purpose out of a bad situation. And so I ended up getting a reentry position at the State Appellate Defender's Office. I did that for 4 years. I did a lot of work with juveniles that were in the process of going to get resentenced, creating reentry plans for them, making sure that when they went to court or when they went to the parole board, they had a plan that outlined the resources that they were going to need to come out here and succeed. And not just do the plan and that's it, but actually help them implement that plan. You know what I'm saying? There were many juvenile lifers that who didn't have family. We're talking about people who have been there for 3, 4, 5 decades, and were coming home after so many years of incarceration with no family, with no friends, and nobody. You know what I'm saying? So I had a fortunate position of being able to go pick them up from prison, take them to eat, get them a phone, and get them going. You know what I'm saying? Because I think it was important for me. Number one, I wanted to make sure that public safety was still being thought about. You know what I'm saying? So I knew that if I helped them get on the path to success, that's one less person that's committing crimes out here. It's one less person that's going to prison. It's one more person rejoining and reunifying with their families. It's one more person that's out here voting, working, and just becoming productive citizens. Because I wanted to show the world that that we were more than just that one bad decision that we made. Children are children. No matter how you look at, no matter how many laws you pass, you can't make a child an adult. It's just not going to happen. Children, of course, should be held accountable. But again, life without parole is just not. You know what I'm saying? And the thing about this legislation that we're trying to pass in Michigan is that it's not a get out of jail free card. All we're saying is give that person an opportunity to go in front of the parole board and say, hey, for these reasons, I believe I'm worthy of a second chance. I'm worthy of mercy and forgiveness. So again, like I was saying with the reentry work, as I was doing the reentry work, I started engaging with a national organization, the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. And I started engaging with them because I remember reading a small little paragraph when I was in prison that said that there was an organization out here, the Incarcerated Children's Advocacy Network. It's a national organization of former juvenile lifers that were advocating around the country to abolish this type of sentence. So the moment I got a chance to learn how to use Facebook, which all it took was like 2 days, I immediately found the person's name who is now the current director of the campaign, McElrath Bay, and I said, hey, this is who I am, this is my experience, and this is how I want to participate. You know what I'm saying? And he and I became good friends. And long story short, 3 weeks later, I got employed by the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. I am now currently the Michigan Campaign Coordinator, leading the efforts here in Michigan to end this type of practice for kids. And it's such a humbling story to think that it all started with that letter that I got from Deborah Bell so many years ago, and here I am now working for an organization that she co-founded. An organization that was co-founded by Brian Stevens, who I like to say that he's a personal friend of mine because I've met him a few times. Right? He's just amazing. Right? And so it's just, this is just proof, man. Like there's, like she said, in Michigan, there's been over 180 who have been released, but throughout the country, there's been over 1,000 former juvenile lifers that have been released throughout the country. And if you go on Google and you look about, I guarantee man, you're going to find about so many of them that are entrepreneurs. They're running, nonprofit organizations. They're being family people. They're just you got some juvenile lifers who have come home and don't want to be part of this movement, and that's okay because the trauma they've been through, they deserve that time to just say, you know what, I'm done with this, right? But they're out here becoming family people. They have kids, they own homes, they're taxpayers, and these are people that we once condemned to life without parole, and these are the people that we said would never amount to nothing, you know. And all it took was just to give them an opportunity, and there's so many more. There's so many more in there that they deserve that very same opportunity. I think we can be, because I want a safe community as well, but I don't want a safe community on the backs of children, right? It doesn't take you telling me that I'm going to send this kid to prison for the rest of his life for me to feel safe in my community. That's not going to make me feel any safer. You know what I'm saying? I personally just don't know, like, it's so easy for people who are far from the problem to want to find a solution for a problem that they've never been up close to. You know what I'm saying? Brian Stevenson talks about all the time about proximity. You know, being up close in front. I'm telling you, man, life without parole sentence for a child is a horrible, horrible sentence, right? Because even though as we get in there, we mentally prepare ourselves to like physically take care of ourselves, it's not the physical thing, it's the mental, right? It's the mental, because when you're laying there in that bunk at nighttime, you're thinking about that life without parole, right? And I remember when I turned 18, I was in tears in my cell because I knew that the kids who I went to school with were graduating from high school, right? I never got to graduate from high school. I never had a license, a car, none of that stuff, you know. And it was just hard, man. It was like, man, even though I knew that I had committed a crime that deserved me, being held accountable, as a child, man, it was just something wrong with it, man. I was like, man, like, you felt helpless, you were like crying out for help, and there's nobody there to help you, and then it's just tough, man. It's just tough. But again, there's a lot of amazing people, man, who have come out of that situation, man. And you would think that after going through something like that, we come out here, man, and be all bugged out, you know what I'm saying? But that's not the case, you know what I'm saying? I don't know, I think there's just something about children who are told that they would never amount to something. I think something inside you tells you, I'm going to show you different. I'm going to show you different. And there's, like I said, over 1,000 of us have showed the system different. We're going to continue to do that. I'm not going anywhere. I am going to continue to push this legislation here in Michigan, not only in Michigan, but throughout this country. And I think we can get it done. So thank you very much.
So next we're going to hear from Barack, but before we do, I'll just say a little more about the history. So one of the things you're hearing very strongly is that no juvenile, probably no person should be sentenced to life without parole. But one of the things that came out in Devil Bell's reports, and our project has really been looking into this, is how much abuse of prosecutorial discretion is at the heart of this system. A significant number, maybe a quarter of juveniles with this sentence were not even the principal in the alleged homicide. They were like in the car or they were along, and they often took the charge because they were the least savvy about knowing to take a plea bargain. The data shows that who you kill, the identity of the victim, is more important than the actual crime committed in terms of what the charge is. It's radically different based on geography, especially about race, as Deb said. And so there are, and what we're going to hear from Baraka, who is someone who faced this too. And way back in the 1970s, Baraka Edward Sanders served 42 years in prison. He, once he got out, he has been a kind of whirlwind of activism and activity like Jose and like so many other people, juvenile lifers. He got a master's degree from the University of Michigan School of Social Work. He's been a consultant to the School of Social Work. He's been a consultant to the Carceral State Project, an incredibly valuable resource and collaborator on our Juvenile Life Without Parole research project. And he worked for the Conviction Integrity Unit here in Washtenaw County, and he's done a lot of other things. He has recently founded a company called Alternative Sentencing and Reentry Solutions as well. So this is Edward Sanders. Also, Barack, over to you.
I'm going to share something with you so I can kind of give you a graphic picture of something. I went to the parole board. The first time I went to the parole board, I served about 7 years. And at this time, the parole board, even though the parole board doesn't have jurisdiction over a person that's serving life without the possibility of parole, they can make recommendations after 10 calendar years. And they can make those recommendations to one person, and that's the person that can possibly give you a commutation, okay, or a pardon. And that would be the governor of the state. So the first time I went to the parole board, remind you, I'm actually coming from the hole. I'm in the hole for fighting. And I go to, it's like 7 years that I've been incarcerated, or a little bit more or less. But in any case, the parole board members say, I'm impressed with you. And that impressed me. I'm in the hole for fighting. And he said, I'm impressed with you. He said, because everybody that came in front of me today, and he pointed to my counselor, he said, this guy said they don't deserve to be back in society. And he said, you're the only one that's coming from the hole, and he still holds the same position about you. And he said, he prepared your record before you went to the hole, and here we are to interview you, and you're in the hole, and he insists that you're ready to go back to society. And he said, I'm impressed with you. And he said, I read your file. Listen to this. Go back to something that you just heard over here. He said, I read your file. And he said, nothing in your file tell me that you did anything different than the prosecutor's witnesses against you and your co-defendant, other than the fact that you didn't take and tell on your co-defendant. He said, nothing in your file tell me anything different. He said, you shouldn't be here. There's nothing in your file that tell me that you should be here. He said, but I tell you what. He said, you need to give me 2 years at least. The next time you come back to the parole board, by the time you got 10 calendar years in, he said, come back without any tickets. He said, you have the ticket every 6 months for fighting. Imagine that. Imagine that. You're in prison, and this guy telling you you shouldn't be here, and the only thing that he's saying, just quit fighting. You know, what are you fighting about? Okay, but that's another story. What are you fighting about? You in prison for something you didn't do. And this guy's telling you, this is a parole board member. And he said, didn't anybody ever tell you you can get out in 10 years? I said, absolutely not. And he said, you can, and we normally release guys like you. With that thin of information against you, we normally release people that look like you in terms of your file. So he said, give me 2 years ticket free, and I guarantee you, I personally would take and recommend to the governor to give you a commutation. That time came around, the same person told me he didn't recall that. The state had attempted to change this policy. Literally changed his policy. So at this time, when he made that statement, I had like 7 years in. But I wound up serving, guess how many? He said 42. It's actually 43 and a half years.
Sorry.
Okay, yeah. Yes, I'm sorry too. Not that you took it minus 1 year, but the years that came even after that. Okay? So I wanted to draw that picture for you guys. When you really think that people are actually being held there because it actually represents a threat. Not true. Not true. This same guy, and I'm going to tell you his name, William Hudson, he later became the chairman of the parole board. When I wrote him a letter and brought this to his attention, he said, no, I didn't say that. More likely I said if you weren't in here for what you did, you wouldn't be here. So Dina was representing, I think that's Dina over there, Dina Anderson. Dina Anderson was working for a state representative named Nelson Saunders. She was the executive assistant, I believe, for this particular state representative. She took and requested my file, but she was always Eddie, can I take and put you up for a commutation? Eddie, can I put you up for a commutation? And I'm like, they ain't going to do anything, Dina. I don't even want you. And she did. I never asked her to do it. She never done it because I always told her no, because I didn't have confidence after that. Imagine that. I didn't have confidence after that. I said no. Didn't even want to put her through the trouble. I didn't want to take and see the opinion because I didn't believe there would be a favorable opinion. She took and got my file and she said exactly what you said they said is in your parole board file. It's in your parole board file. They got a record where the guy said that if you take and give him 2 years ticket free, that he would make a recommendation to the governor. It never happened. I served more than 3 decades after that. 3 decades. You think I stabbed somebody after that? You think I shot somebody after that? None of those things. None of those things happened after that. I got an associate's degree after that. I got a bachelor's degree after that. I probably took advantage of half a dozen vocational trades, television studio, machine shop, small injury repair. You know, I mean, just go on and on and on. But trouble? Nah. I got in trouble for refusing to take a drug test. So for what? They was telling me they was trying to prove that the guards were bringing drugs in. So they wanted to see how many prisoners actually got drugs in the system. I'm like, well, what that got to do with me? Absolutely not. If I turn over for that, what good would I be back in society? If every time you took and wanted to violate my privacy, my private right, what good would that do? So I said no to drug tests. But do I use drugs? No, I'm a Muslim. I pray 5 times a day. I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't do none of those things. Even while I'm here in society. If I go to a bar with the senator, he'll be drinking by himself. I'm going to order water. Good, I'll be with him. I've been with Alex Savage, the prosecutor in the county. I've been with Victoria Burton Harris and some of the candidates that's running for sheriff. They all drink by themselves. I order water or pop. Okay, I order pop. Not because Mama's saying so, but because those are my principles. Those are my principles. But I want you to know that when you think that people are in prison because they represent a danger to society. We have a statute for aiding and abetting. In England, those statutes were used to take and hold everyone accountable. At some point, they abolished the distinction between the principal and the assessor because there was procedural problems where if you hadn't apprehended the principal, you could never hold accountable the assessor. So they was like, that don't work. All the principal had to do is run off, and the assessor could just sit there all day and take credit for what he did and never be held accountable. So they abolished that. But they use it now to prosecute children. Most of the children that are convicted for murder are aiders and abettors. They're not the principal. One of the things that guys used to take and mock me and other kids in the prison, you're a generic killer. They said, you're a generic killer. You ain't killed nobody. And you serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. There's no such thing as killing somebody that you didn't kill. But children, and they use the aider and abettor statute more so against children than they do adults. Okay? So you wind up with 3, 4, 5 kids in prison, one person, one homicide, one shot fighter, and you have 3 or 4 kids, and most of the time it's 3 or 4 black kids. These are the kind of laws that I expect you as our future leaders to change. These are the kind of laws, okay? Now that I'm home, okay? I got out in 2017, so I went to prison in 1975. I came just after my 17th birthday. I came home in 2017, just before my 60th birthday. Okay? I contacted her office before I got out of prison because I had issues with the ex post facto, that is where they took and came up with a rule after the fact. Everyone inside of the prison system is supposed to benefit for good time. There was no cutouts. It even included lifers. And lifers had been getting out for years and getting a good time. To show you how ugly the statute was that they created for juvenile lifers, they specifically, after they couldn't get the number of years they wanted in the statute, they said, don't give any of them a good time. It goes against the very idea of a second chance. You find this person meritable to release for his or her good behavior while in prison, demonstrate that they're worthy of a second chance, but then turn around and say they can't have their good time for good behavior while in prison. Okay, but Deborah LaBelle took that argument to University of Michigan, won eventually in the federal court. We got the good time. I wound up being on parole for about maybe 6 months. That gave me the opportunity to then put my application in at the University of Michigan. So by the fall, I got out in 2017. By the fall of 2018, I was a candidate for MSW. By 2020, I was a graduate from the University of Michigan School of Social Work. I graduated and immediately got a job at the prosecutor's office in their conviction, integrity, and expungement unit. And there are only a few conviction integrity units in the country. Okay, and this one also have an expungement unit. So I got a chance to take and do something, guess what, that I was doing in prison. I was a jailhouse attorney. So this is what I've done in prison. I didn't come home to do this. I've done this while in prison. And I went to prison not being able to read or write. Not being able to read or write. I learned to write and read in prison. When it was too emotional to work on my own case, like the facts that the parole board recognized you in here for nothing. It was too emotional for me to deal with my own case. I turned to my fellow prisoners and worked on their case, fellow inmates. I worked on their case until it allowed me to transition to my own case. Okay? My class was fuller than this room. I was told I had too many people on the first day of my law class that we were in violation of the fire code in the building. Okay, so I committed a crime the first day of my law class. Okay, not that anybody did any fire, but I was told, you want to tell half of them to leave? And I was like, no. And so we sit there until we negotiated a future reduction in the class by taking and breaking my class up into 2 sessions on a Tuesday and a Wednesday. I'm saying, because I ain't telling nobody they got to go. And I didn't tell anybody they got to go. We had more than 100 people show up on the first day of class. Okay? But this is the same person that stayed in prison for 43 and a half years. There was a deputy warden when Lansing got old, because I taught civil, criminal, administrative law. Then I called myself getting smart. We're going to now teach procedural, legislative procedure. And some lawmaker took and contacted the director of MDOC, cut it down. Okay, they cut it off. Despite the fact we had members of the bar, attorneys, prosecutors, and lawyers, and all coming in and participating. I made it a point that whatever I taught on before it was concluded, that we had a member of the bar take and come in and speak on the subject. So I make sure that these guys felt confident that they had got good information on whatever subject. They did an audit of the class and said, stop it. Stop it. Okay, so this is the kind of trouble I got in the joint. This was the kind of trouble I got in with lawyers, prosecutors, attorneys, that other kind of stuff. But in any case, what happened is I still served 43 and a half years. So what threat was I? The one deputy warden that went to Lansing to vet for my class, the director at the Mount Correctional Facility for the prisoner programming, said he ought to support any prison programming. And he told the deputy warden programming to sit down, that he's going to argue to keep your program. This was the deputy warden of security. And they still turned him down. And she said that, hey, he took an argument that we got a grade A. We got a first aid class, and we ain't paying a dime for it. The prisoners teaching. They still told him, sit down, you got nothing coming, and they closed down my class. I went into a depression that I had experienced since when the prison had a riot back in Iona. Okay? When, they literally came through the prison system as a way of retaliating, took every prisoner's property and just simply threw it away. Everybody was left with a bare sale. Everything was considered a potential hazard and threat to the guards and everything. So they literally came in, took guys' TVs, radios, foot lockers, their shoes, their coats, their pants, or whatever, and threw everything away. And some prisoners, worked in the prison industry, had nothing to do with the riot, etc. But that was how they responded. And I went into a depression. And it took me for a while before I came out of that depression. And that was because I seen myself doing something meaningful. Okay? I didn't resume that type of work until I came home and worked for the prosecutor's office briefly. But just to give you an idea, those are the kind of people that's a threat in our prison system. Thank you.
So, I like how you said people in Michigan can change the laws. Senator Jeff Irwin was an undergraduate political science major at the University of Michigan. Like a number of you I know also are studying even in that department. And so Jeff Irwin is a Michigan State Senator representing this area in Washtenaw County. He previously served on the Washtenaw County Commission, and then in the Michigan House where he was term limited out. Senator Irwin is one of the politicians that make you really wish we didn't have term limits in this state, and he has been a kind of whirlwind at the center of introducing all kinds of bills and being in the center of all kinds of movements, juvenile justice reform and many other things, including a bill to abolish the sentence of juvenile life without parole. And over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that excellent glowing introduction. I don't know where to start, but actually I do know where to start. I want to start where Deborah Bell started, and I want to put just a little bit of a spin on the information that she gave you. The bottom line of what she was saying at the beginning of her talk is that here in these United States, we are the harshest system in the world and lock up more juveniles than any other country in the world. And here in Michigan, we're in the state that locks up more juveniles than any other state. So therefore, here in Michigan, we are in the epicenter of juvenile injustice. We are at the heart of the problem with locking up kids, throwing away the key, and giving them no chance in their life. It's cruel and unusual punishment, is what the Supreme Court said. But I'm glad you're here tonight, because I think there are very few people here in the state of Michigan who understand the simple fact that there is no place in the world where they treat juvenile offenders worse than here in Michigan. It's a big part of why we have some of the most crowded prisons in the country. It's a big part of why we have one of the oldest prison populations in the country. And so once again, here in a nation that is addicted to incarceration, Michigan stands out as a state that is particularly harsh. And the company that we're standing with are states like Louisiana and Mississippi, Georgia. And I think that the professor said something at the beginning when he was explaining some of the history of how we got here. And he mentioned racism. And I just want to snap my feet a little bit and say that there is almost no issue here in the state of Michigan that is not affected by racism. But when you look at this issue of juvenile justice, when you look at this issue of how have we gotten it so wrong so consistently here in the state of Michigan, it's absolutely about racism. And it's about the way that people all over the state have felt about Detroit. It's about the reaction to the crack epidemic. It's about that moment in time that we were in the 80s and 90s when we did not know how to distinguish between people who we were afraid of and people we were mad at. And so we need to have a system here in our state that provides an opportunity for people who've done things, even things that are very bad, when they're kids, to have that chance to get out. And so that's why I've introduced legislation. I've got the numbers here so I don't screw them up. Senate Bill 119 through 123 is a package of bills to end juvenile life without parole here in Michigan. There's also a House companion, a House package, House Bills 4160 through 4164. My partner in the House on this, the one who's leading the package in the House, is Representative Amos O'Neill from Saginaw. Anybody from the Saginaw area here? All right, well, if you were, I'd encourage you to think. Representative O'Neill. And what these bills seek to do is these bills seek to, as I said, end a juvenile life without parole and replace it instead with a system whereby when juveniles commit serious crimes, they could be sentenced under our bills to a term of years of 10 to 60 years. So, we're not talking about, not holding people accountable. I think Mr. Burgos was talking about this. No one's talking about not holding people accountable for committing serious crimes. But what we're talking about is, let's have a process whereby instead of judging this child and determining the course of their entire life right in the wake of the most horrible thing they've ever done, instead of making that decision then, instead of deciding whether or not this person has a chance of rehabilitation when they're still a child, when they've just committed the crime, no, what we're saying with our legislation is let's make that decision when we have more and better information about who this person is. Let's make that decision when we have more and better information about whether they can be successful on the outside. The last person who should be deciding whether or not a juvenile offender has been rehabilitated when they're 30, 40, 50, 60 years old is that judge who's sentencing them right in the wake of whatever crime was committed to get them accused of a crime in the first place. And these judges are bad. These judges are politicians. These judges are reacting to a community that's mad. But more importantly than that, they simply don't know who this person's going to be decades later. And you've heard from a couple of gentlemen tonight who I think have told very compelling stories. But you don't have to just listen to these compelling anecdotes. You don't just have to listen to the awesome people that they've become. You can look at these statistics. Juvenile offenders, people who were sentenced to juvenile life without parole and who then have gotten out, have an impossibly tiny, an infinitesimally small rate of reoffending. And it's completely out of line with the rates of reoffending with prisoners generally. Recidivism is a problem. It's a problem that we talk about a lot. How do we address it? How do we put in the proper supports? How do we make sure that people, can be successful on the outside? But this group of juvenile offenders, for a lot of reasons, I think, have been incredibly successful. They've been incredibly successful. So, I guess I wanted to say a couple more things. One is, given all these facts, and given the facts that my colleagues have heard from these individuals, right, and we've been talking about this for a number of years, given the fact that Miller v. Alabama was over a decade ago, why isn't this fixed in Michigan? It's fixed in so many other states. It's fixed in liberal states like West Virginia, right, in Arkansas, like states that you wouldn't normally think would be ahead of Michigan with respect to doing the right thing for human beings. Texas. Right? Why is it? Well, honestly, I think it gets back to where we started. It gets back to racism and fear. And it gets back to the simple fact that today, in today's America, there's a battle for the future of America, a political battle that I'm absolutely engaged in. I hope everyone is engaged in as well. And Democrats are trying to retain power in the state of Michigan. We have the first Democratic majority in the state legislature in 40 years, which is the only reason why any of us think this is at all possible. The first time in 40 years that Democrats have controlled the Michigan legislature. And so, maybe it's possible now. But the issue that we're up against is that my Democratic colleagues believe, and they're right, that next year when the election comes around, Republicans are going to bring out the same playbook. And they're going to try to weaponize fear, they're going to try to weaponize racism to drive a wedge and get more votes. And they know that in places like Macomb County, in places like Oakland County, sometimes in places like Washington County, this is a very effective wedge. People are afraid. Crime is at a 30-year low point. But people are still motivated by those stories that they hear on the news. And I can tell you, I knock doors all over the state. If anybody wants to go and do political work with me next fall, I'd love to have you. People respond to this stuff. People don't know about the crime statistics. They don't know that crime is at a 30-year low. They don't know that these juvenile offenders have been incredibly successful when they've been given a second chance. but they do know about the Oxford shooter. They know about that, and they're going to keep knowing about it. They're going to keep hearing about it. And when we have hearings in the Michigan legislature, we get to hear from some of these experts, but we also hear from folks who are stoking that fear. We're saying, what about this one horrible anecdote? What about this case? Shouldn't this person, isn't this an example of that one very, very rare case? And all we're asking is, all right, let's give the system the tools. Let's let the parole board look at these people. Let's let them call the balls and the strikes between that very, very special case and all the rest of the cases where there are people that, yes, have done something wrong, but they've turned their lives around. They're ready to get out. They've been rehabilitated in ways that are demonstrable in their file. And in many cases, some of these people are victims of real injustices at their sentencing. So we need to get these people out. We're talking about a group of people who are still suffering under this policy on the inside, and we're also talking about all the future kids in Michigan who have to engage with the justice system. And we need to continue to fight for a system that is fair and that it doesn't succumb to that fear and that racism that's designed the system we have now. So I would ask each of you, if you care about this issue, so thank you for coming tonight, think about reaching out to your legislator. If I represent you, great, awesome. I appreciate being able to talk to my direct reports. Let me know what else you want me to do. I'm happy to have that conversation. I genuinely love this stuff. But if you hail from another part of the state, reach out to your legislators. Ask them, what do you think about these bills? What do you think about this policy? Will you stand up for justice? Will you vote yes? Because I think what also stops a lot of my colleagues is not just the political fear, it's that they're not hearing from their residents that this is important to them. And if you can help them hear it, I think it'll make a difference. Thanks.
I'm glad Senator Irwin brought up Saginaw and the rest of the state, because also we've talked a lot about Detroit, and a really large number of juvenile life without parole cases were black youth from Detroit. But if you look at the data, it's Saginaw, Pontiac, Flint, Grand Rapids, Benton Harbor. Back in 2000, the Census Bureau released its report, and it showed that 8 of the 20 most racially segregated metropolitan areas at that time were in the state of Michigan. 8 of 20 nationwide. We are significantly more segregated by housing than most southern states, for example. And so these are the same places, with the interesting exception of Lansing, where there was, I think, a more progressive black prosecutor. These are the same places that produced a huge percentage of the juvenile life without parolers. In every case, no matter what the circumstances were, involved prosecutorial discretion to bring that charge, or discretion at some level in the system. So the final speaker we're going to have is Kimberly Thomas. Kimberly is the co-director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic at the University of Michigan Law School and a clinical professor of law there. And I believe you're on Governor Whitmer's Juvenile Justice Reform Task Force, which you were too, weren't you, Jose?
Yeah,
among other things. And so I've done a lot of work in this area more broadly, but also pro bono work on juvenile life without parole cases too. So,
Great, thank you so much. So I want to give a little more depth to the discussion of Miller, but first recognize the only reason that Miller came about is the kind of activism and organizing and base building and interdisciplinary work that led to that. So, sometimes we have this discussion like Miller sort of popped out of nowhere, and that's just not the case. And so, I think we want to, be realistic about the power of the courts and the lack of power of the courts in some instances. But Miller came out in 2012, and it built on some prior cases that did recognize that young people are constitutionally different for purposes of sentencing, and enshrined that in our federal constitution, which was an incredibly important moment. It also recognized what people had known for a long time, and what adolescent development research had shown, is that young people lack the maturity and impulse control, that they're susceptible to negative peer influences, more so than adults. And they have a moral character that is still developing, that they are not fully the humans that they're going to be once they're no longer young people. And those differences make all the difference in the world for purposes of sentencing. And so Miller said that when we look at these cases and look at these resentencing hearings, only the rare youth is going to be the one who we can determine, or somehow determine, I'm not quite sure how, to be irreparably corrupt. The court, the U.S. Supreme Court in Miller, had lower courts look at 5 factors, and I think those are important to highlight, both because they are important to the Miller decision, but also how they've been used in the implementation in the states. And so the court said you had to look at the young person's age and their immaturity, their family and home circumstances and environments, the offense, including the role that the person had, and any influence of peers in that case. So Mr. Sanders was talking about aiding and abetting, right? The fact that someone's an aider and abetter should be a relevant fact for determining their relative culpability. The incapacities of youth that may have disadvantaged the youth in dealing with the justice system, this idea that Professor Lassiter talked about, where maybe the young person is the only person who doesn't take a plea. Everyone else is going to flip and testify against the young person, but they're the one who ends up with the life without parole sentence, regardless of their role in the offense, because they didn't perceive that that was, maybe the smart way to get them a younger, lesser sentence, but instead thought that, they would just go through with the trial, or didn't have effective assistance of counsel to really help them understand that decision. And the court required a look at potential for rehabilitation. Deb mentioned that the implementation of these in Michigan has been really challenging. So I've been privileged to represent a number of juvenile lifers here in Michigan. And I'm going to take a little poetic license, but really only a little bit, when I say that the arguments from prosecutors and the decisions from judges at these hearings were a little bit like this. The person is 17, and so they're close to 18, and so they're just like an adult. Or the person is 15, but they're really smart, and so we're not going to give them the mitigation of youth. And so that's how these factors have been implemented. The young person was the person who gave the gun, and so that makes them more culpable. The young person was the person who received the gun and committed the shooting, so that made them more culpable. There was a psychiatrist report in the 1980s that found them that they were a psychopath, and even though you can't diagnose a teenager with psychopathy, that's why we're going to give life without parole in this instance. They had a really traumatic childhood, and so they were worried that they won't rehabilitate. They didn't have a traumatic childhood, and so we think that they don't deserve the mitigation of youth. And on and on and on. And these are really the kinds of implementation of the Miller factors that we've seen in Michigan, which has been very frustrating, they previously had been implemented without any standards, without any burdens, so it was a bit of a Wild West for a long time. Deb mentioned that our state, even though Miller was a federal constitutional decision, most criminal justice or criminal legal system work is in state courts. So in the year, 1.9 million people were incarcerated, 1.5 million of those people are on state court systems. And so all of the implementation of these rules occurs within the state courts. And so, and states can have constitutional protections that are greater than the federal constitutional protection. And so one aspect of the work has been to try to look to our state constitutional protections here in Michigan to broaden and secure the base for juveniles who are facing life without parole. And so within the past few years, there have been some really decisions from our state Supreme Court that have been true to the spirit of Miller, that have required the government to bear the burden in these cases. that have required it to be a greater burden than they were arguing, that have banned life with parole for juveniles, mandatory life with parole for juveniles, because our state parole board wasn't paroling people, and so it was an effective life sentence, that expanded to 18, the consideration for youth who were serving life without parole. And so there's been some efforts by our state courts to be true to the spirit and the law of Miller and to really implement those, but it is slow work. The courts are slow work and have their limitations. I would say that Miller in Michigan is particularly bad, but it's also important to not lose sight that we are emblematic of the trends in mass incarceration nationally. And so in the early 1970s, there were 9 people serving juvenile life without parole, right? This is not the natural order of things. There's no reason it has to be this way. We've created this through the increase in mass incarceration, through the changes in law during the super predator era, super predator scare, and we need to revert back to that more sensible time. And so just to step back and know that this is not how things should be or are and have to be, that we have created this mass incarceration system. And Michigan's juvenile lifer policies are sort of the worst case example of that, but are certainly have all the other characteristics of the policies that we've seen.
So I do want to reiterate, because we've talked a lot about how bad things are in Michigan, that there has been some real hopeful developments in recent years. Michigan, I'm not sure any of us actually clarified, was one of the only states in the country in which 17-year-olds were always charged as adults. They weren't waived, they were adults. And that law, the Raise the Age campaign, which was a huge activist movement, got that. The 17-year-olds are now presumptively in the juvenile system unless they're waived. That was a real development. And then, as Kimberly Thomas said, the Michigan State Supreme Court, some pretty progressive decisions, including saying that all 18-year-olds in the state have to be resentenced if they're serving a mandatory life without parole, which is going to create a lot more work for Deborah LaBelle and Kimberly Thomas and a lot of the lawyers, but the burden of proof is now on the prosecutor to make the case that people should be kept in prison for the rest of their lives, which is an important development. So we'd like to see if anybody in the audience has questions for anybody on the panel. And yeah, I think you'd be able to shout it out and we'll be able to hear you, but let's see. Question? Oh, we'll see.
I can take the mic.
Well, you're on the panel. Questions? Yes.
So you talked about how prosecutorial discretion have played a huge part in the rate of these youths being sentenced to life. But what would you say is the most effective way that a prosecutor might be able to combat that, like the flip side of it, basically?
Are you asking about what a progressive prosecutor
Yeah.
would do?
Yeah.
Well, you know, we had
our, at least, you know, there were prosecutors who took the pledge. Ellie Savitt said that he would never sentence a child to seek a life without parole sentence for a child. Carol Simeon in Ingham County said the same thing. And Karen McDonald, before she did 3 backflips, said and committed that I will never, and I was in the room, I will never abandon a child to a life without hope behind bars before she sought life without parole for either her, which she continues to do.
That's the Oxford
School shootings.
Oxford school shooting.
So, you know, there were prosecutors who said that. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of, you know, prosecutors that said it had a lot of cover. They could say, you know, it's being applied erratically and arbitrarily. It's being applied with racial disparity. And, the other thing that prosecutors could say is that the sentence that a youth could give is the maximum is 60 years. No one who went as a child in Michigan for the last 100 years has ever made it that long. So there's no public safety risk. If the parole board decides that you are not one who can go home at this time, you will die in prison, but you won't die without hope. And that's a big issue here. And you won't die without a second look. So, it befuddles me, frankly. There's no public safety risk. There's nothing but, standing up for integrity and human rights and saying, I won't do it.
Anybody else?
I'll just add a couple things. One is that the Prosecuting Attorneys Association of Michigan has a lot of political power. And when they come into a committee room and they say, we oppose this legislation, if you pass it, it will make communities less safe, that carries weight with a lot of my colleagues. I'll also point out that the Prosecuting Attorneys Association of Michigan, and I believe every single prosecutor in the state, opposes my legislation. Certainly the ones that I've heard from all oppose it, even ones that I consider relatively progressive. It's because we've bent our laws year after year to become more and more aggressive towards crime, but also to give prosecutors more and more authority. Same with police, I think. And you've seen these policies just really go off the page to the right side. I mean, back in, before the 1930s, if a prosecutor wanted to charge a juvenile as an adult in any sort of case, they had to present that to the judge. They had to make an argument, and then the judge would determine, yes, this person can be charged as an adult or not. Ever since then, that decision is made by the prosecutor under their sole discretion. And just like with that issue, the prosecutors have acquired more and more and more power in the system over the years. And it's very, very easy, very, very difficult to retract that. The easiest kind of bill to pass in Lansing is a bill that increases penalties for a crime. That's the easiest kind of bill to pass. And one of the hardest kinds of bills to pass is anything that reforms our criminal justice system at all.
If I may, I started an organization, Alternative Sentencing and Reentry Solutions. What I would advocate in terms of alternative is that prosecutors could, if they wanted to, that very aiding and abetting statute, instead of charging a child under the first-degree murder statute and then going before a jury under the theory of aiding and abetting, they could actually charge the child with the aiding and abetting statute itself. That statute says that anyone who is found guilty for the particular act of the aiding and abetting they're accused of will serve the same amount of time as though they had committed that offense. So it wouldn't stop the child from being sentenced to life in prison. It would only prohibit, which comes into a second statute, which is the parole statute. It is the parole statute that says that the person that is convicted for aiding and abetting or convicted for first-degree murder cannot be paroled. It don't say that about aiding and abetting. I did research years ago, decades ago. I found one attorney that made a very compelling argument that the prosecutor should have been charging his client under the aiding and abetting statute, because he was saying that charging the client with the higher statute, the murder statute, will foreclose the possibility of parole and prevent the parole board from considering that person's participation, which is less than the principal. And it was and that argument kind of fits in the day where the U.S. Supreme Court, others have considered this issue, saying that the child that commits aiding and abetting is moved away from the crime at least twice, particularly like in the felony murder cases. But attorneys are not doing this. They're not making these arguments. We only happened upon, we had a similar statute, which is conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. For a while, a Democrat Attorney General, Frank Kelly, ruled that the person that committed a conspiracy should do the same amount of time as a person that was that actually committed murder. And so we had people in prison for conspiracy to commit murder and nobody was killed. And to the Supreme Court, it just happened during an oral argument. The prosecutor and the other attorney, the defense attorney, happened to be arguing, and the Supreme Court noticed they were both in agreement that the person is eligible for parole. So they wind up taking and resolving the matter like that. But we don't have attorneys that's creative enough, that's challenging enough. They go into the system and just go for whatever. You know, they just continue to take and do the same thing like hamsters on a wheel.
I think your question was a good one, and I think just 2 points there. It's only the prosecutor who can get life without parole. If a prosecutor doesn't seek it, the judge is not entitled to issue it. So the prosecutor holds all of the control here. And the second point being, we've been doing polling for 20 years on this issue, almost. And the public almost uniformly, I mean, it's in the high 70s, say they don't want this sentence. They want youth to be held accountable, children be held accountable, but they don't believe that you should never give a child a second look. And so those are important things to push on your prosecutors.
I'm actually going to ask one follow-up question and then go to you in the back, sir. So, I mentioned before, most juveniles in the adult system did not take a homicide charge. Like there's rampant transfer of juveniles, and I just wonder. I know Jose and Kimberly were on the Juvenile Justice Task Force. That report discussed, but said we just need to study more whether prosecutors should even have the power to make the decision to waive it all. And I imagine if I asked Senator Irwin if you could get a bill through the legislature taking that power away from prosecutors.
Introduce that bill.
So maybe you could tell us a little bit about it, and you could tell us, because we're talking about controlling the damage when you say, okay, a juvenile should be only serving 10 to 60 years. But the question is, could we ever actually stop the ability of elected prosecutors to put juveniles in the adult system in the first place?
I mean, I think they shouldn't have that power. You know what I'm saying? Just plain and simple. You know what I'm saying? Like they were saying, these prosecutors, man, number one, they're elected, right? So, it's messed up how our system is so tied to politics. You know what I'm saying? Like a lot of these prosecutors are imposing these sentences, are seeking these type of sentences in many cases that just don't warrant it. I know a juvenile who's actually still waiting to be resentenced. He was with adults. He was with 2 adults. A shooting took place. He wasn't the person who shot. But the adults had the mental capacity to, again, engage in the defense and say, well, we're going to take pleas. They took pleas to 10 or 12 years, like that. These are the actual shooters. And then the juvenile, who also was actually shot during the process of the situation, who didn't shoot nobody, who didn't kill nobody, he ended up getting life without parole. So make that make sense. He was taken by adults that took advantage of him, took advantage of his vulnerability, and took him on this crime, and then they get 10 years for actually committing the crime, and just because the kid went there with them, he's doing life without parole, and here it is, years after Miller, and he's still waiting to get resentenced. And that's just not fair, and that's why I believe that the prosecutors should be taking that away from them, because they're definitely imposing it too many times, and more than likely, it's a crime, it's a sentence, it's a charge that's being imposed on black and brown kids. I mean, that's just the bottom truth. You know what I'm saying? It's going on and on and on. I don't get these prosecutors, man, but I think they should be stripped from that possibility.
Just a little additional background on how it works. So if someone is 14 or over and they commit a number of what are considered to be more serious crimes, so these are not just homicides, the prosecutor has the sole discretion about whether to charge them in adult court. And so that young person who's 14, who commits an armed robbery, or who commits some other, more serious crime but not a homicide can automatically be charged in adult court. There is nothing the judge can do to send that person back to juvenile court. There is nothing the lawyer can do to send that juvenile back to juvenile court. There is nothing that that child can do to get back to juvenile court. That is solely within the discretion of the prosecutor. When we were on the task force, I will say that there's a widespread problem in Michigan because our courts are so decentralized about data. But we do not know how many kids are being waived and transferred from, and should be in juvenile court and are in adult court. We don't even know the answer to that question, right? So we are really at the beginning of unraveling this problem. And that I would say the task force recommendation resulted in that because there was less attention to this issue at that level during the task force, and there's a lot of work to be done that hasn't been done yet.
There's also, within the group of people that are being waived over, there's a group, the prosecutors sometimes take and commit a child, or the state commit a child as a ward of the state. That person is supposed to be a ward of the state until at least they're 19 years old. And if the prosecutor doesn't file a petition before their 19th birthday, then they're to be released. But if the prosecutor files a petition, they can keep the person all the way to the 21. But they have situations like where Michigan was treating a child that was 17 automatically as an adult. But let's say, like in the case of Kincaid, that later got out of prison and died of a brain hemorrhage. But he was 16 years old at the time. And that he was put in a youth home, and then he escaped from the youth home. When they caught him, he was 17. But that was one of his arguments was that the state still had jurisdiction over him. I made that argument.
And so it's worth noticing that the 17-year-olds until recently never went to juvenile court, and so this was a real, all of those kids no one even made a decision about them, and so there were questions about whether they should be in juvenile court at all.
And so when there was a legislative effort to try to raise the age and try to say that no, we're going to make sure that we treat 17-year-olds as children, there was legislation put together, and at that time there was this idea that maybe we should reinstate some level of judicial review around these prosecutors and their sole discretion, right? One of the better elements of our system are this idea that we should have checks and balances, and that sort of unchecked authority from one individual leads to problems. And so folks were trying to get that in there. But I think that part of the reason why the task force didn't delve into this stuff a lot is the data, but I also think it's the same reason why 10 years ago when the Raise the Age package was put together, they didn't fundamentally restore judicial review, and everybody that was involved in putting the legislation together agreed that if we don't continue to give prosecutors sole discretion over charging juveniles as adults in a wide range of crimes, then we can't pass the legislation. So what I did is I introduced legislation that restored judicial review across the board for all juvenile cases for two reasons. One, because I think it's obviously the right thing to do. I mean, for me, it was a no-brainer from just like a moral and a policy standpoint. This is the right approach. This is the way we used to do it. This is the way we should do it. Unchecked sole discretion for prosecutors is a bad idea. The judge should be there to check that. The other reason I introduced it was because there were a lot of my fellow legislators who were saying, I don't know about this juvenile justice package. Maybe some of these 17-year-olds should, I don't know, these people did bad things, and, they're very worried about it. So I wanted to kind of put a stake in the ground over to the left of that bill package and say, well, wait a second, over here, there's a bunch of us that think this doesn't go nearly far enough, to try to give a little bit of political room to some of my colleagues who, maybe felt like the Raise the Age bills were going too far, when actually they were very modest.
In the back, sir.
Yeah, my name is Ronnie Waters. So the panel was outstanding. Everybody up there is a warrior in their own right. If I had a stronger word for Deborah, I would call her whatever that is. But, yeah, and Senator Irvin, who I really respect and just admire, but you had said something earlier about the reasons why you guys don't want to act is because Republicans are going to label you as soft on crime. What they labeled you as soft on crime in the last election, in the election before that, and the election before that. And that's what they're going to do. You made a compelling argument on why this should be abolished. That same argument you made to anybody that you knock on the door, they say, hey, you voted for the life without parole bill for juveniles. And you make that argument and you won't have anything to worry about. But we have to really consider who we send in the Lansing if they won't stand up on this moral issue and get these bills passed. Because that's just an excuse that is unacceptable for most of the people that I get in contact with on a daily basis. So we got to have the courage to act. And I'm sure Senator Irvin does have this courage. But we have to tell these people in Lansing that this is something that we want done. And until we do it, people are going to say, well, they're going to let me soft on crime, and I'm not going to do anything.
Thank you. I'll just respond to that really quickly and say I absolutely agree with you. It's one of the reasons why I encourage everybody in the room to reach out to their legislators, because by telling them that you care about this, by telling them that you think that passing these bills is the right thing to do, that gives them additional steel in their spine to do the right thing and to believe what you said, which is that, you know, we can have a conversation with the community about this and be successful. I think you're right, but that does take work. And part of that work is done by those of us who have to introduce bills and have to cajole my colleagues. I tell my colleagues the same thing. You know, you can vote for this bill and do the right thing, and they're going to call you a scoundrel, or you can not vote for this bill and do the wrong thing, and they're going to still call you a scoundrel. And so why the heck do any of us do any of this work if we're not going to go and do the right thing? So I'll continue to say that to my colleagues, but they need to hear it from their communities as well. And so, thank you for your help.
Speak up.
My question concerns like the variance in like the people who own and lead both public and private prisons. Essentially, do you think that, and I believe there's some research on this, you may know, that the possibility of life without parole is greater in private prisons? Do you have thoughts on this?
Well, I don't think that it's a sentence before you're sent to the prison.
It's the repeal process that I'm concerned.
This is a question about private prisons, which I do not think are.
Yeah, so we have so many bad things here, and that is not one of them. So our prisons are publicly run. We have very few privately run. I mean, they're contract. There's like a lot of exceptions, but in the sense of, I think that you're describing, where in some states there are prisons that are completely profit-driven, and that's their, they're corporately owned, profit-driven prisons. We don't have that in the same way as some other states. And not to say that we've
Anymore.
There was one judge that was sentenced to prison for sending kids to prison, and then he did the kickback.
The juvenile judge who was.
But I do want to add one thing. Michigan did have actually. We actually had a prison that was called Punk Prison. And one of the reasons why Punk Prison is no longer open is because the super predator myth that everybody was talking about, it just never came about. You know what I'm saying? So they built a prison based on the super predator myth that, hey, we're going to have this big wave of juvenile crime is going to happen, so we're going to need a prison specifically for these kids. And then when they built it, they ended up having to close it because that never panned out.
So we've been talking politics, but what happened in '88? Our Democrats were like so right. They were just so punitive about this. And then in '96, Engler comes along, and it was so much worse. And Governor Engler, the Republican governor elected in the '90s, constantly, like in the State of the State address, would talk about punks and thugs. And so he opened in a closed prison, what he called the punk prison, and it was supposed to be just a stigmatizing place that young black kids from Detroit and Flint and elsewhere would just be sent like way far away, and that's this like it would be a great senior honors thesis or something. This debacle idea of this pump.
Yeah, a tiny piece of this. The prison was closed in 2006 by Governor Granholm for a lot of reasons, partly a lot of lawsuits because kids were getting abused there. The facility, though, now is owned by Geo Group, which, if you're interested in this issue, you know about Corrections Corporation of America and Geo Group. These are the big players in the private prison area. They've been trying to get back in Michigan, so they own this facility. They own this facility in Baldwin. Right now, they have a contract with the federal government to put federal prisons there, but there are no state privatized prisons in the state of Michigan. MDOC is required to bid out prison work to private prison operations on a regular basis per state statute that was passed in 2012, I believe, which is why I've introduced legislation to repeal that section and ban private prisons in Michigan, because they don't work. But there aren't actually any private prisons in Michigan except for the one that the federal government contracts for in Baldwin. It's an immigration lockup, I believe.
Yeah.
All right, other questions? Yeah, right there.
Yes, I would like to know what you think, each of you, is the reason or what primarily accounts for such a low recidivism rate for formerly incarcerated juveniles.
What was the question?
Let me repeat it. What accounts for the very low recidivism rate for formerly incarcerated juvenile lifers? That's the question, sir?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I think, I honestly, Michigan has the lowest recidivism rate as far as all the prisoners, right? So it's like at 27% or something, right? And while the MDOC may want to take credit for that low recidivism rate, I think the reason why the recidivism rate, not only that one, but also the juvenile lifer recidivism rate is so low, is because of a strong community that we built, right? I'm saying a lot of us, we hold each other accountable. I try to maintain communication with them as possible, and we help each other out. When there's services available, when there's jobs available, say, hey bro, there's a job over here, there's a job over there. So I want to believe that that's one of the strongest reasons why the recidivism rate is so low, is because we're holding each other accountable. We're making sure that we also know that there's so many of us that are still left behind. And if any one of us mess up, they're gonna try to do what they did to us back in the early 80s and 90s, is try to put that narrative out there again, like we told you they were no good. You know what I'm saying? So I personally am trying to make sure that they can't do that.
I think the State Appellate Defender's Office, SATO, has done an excellent job. SATO, the State Appellate Defender's Office, they looked out, they went out of the box. They didn't just simply take and campaign for their clients to come home. But once they came home, they began to take and provide them with resources in terms of reentry. And their reentry, as far as I'm concerned, is none, compared to none other. They have taken consistently, took and provided workshops and things of that nature. Joe had worked with them for the last 4 years. When I came home, I took and joined that, even though I had a private attorney. I took and asked my attorney to contact the State Appellate Defender's Office and asked them if I could participate in their reentry program. Their reentry program was created by a student at the School of Social Work who was from Japan, I believe. And he established it while he was here, attended school here at U of M School of Social Work. And many of his participants, his interns, are from the University of Michigan. Some have come from Wayne State University, etc. But they have a program that's not comparable to anyone else. And so I admire them for that. And that has to be said. In fact, one of their social workers that took him past, she was also a social worker and attorney. I'm lost on the name. Catherine Ruth. Catherine Ruth was both a social worker and attorney. I remember her dog named Tina. Nice, big, old, beautiful pit bull.
Could I expound on that question that was asked? I think it's important that I was a juvenile lifer, and everybody told me I was the worst of the worst, and there was no hope for me. I never believed that. So while I was in prison, I decided. Not when I came home, no re-entry program, but in prison, I aged out of crime, I aged out of criminal thinking. And that's most juveniles. And I'm determined that all the bad things that were said to me, I was going to change the narrative on that. So when we finally released, we decided that in prison, decades ago. I stayed in prison 40 years, but I decided that I wasn't a criminal decades ago. So when I got my chance to come out here and prove it, you know, I was prepared. And that's how a lot of juveniles think. They're not, when they come out, well, I guess I won't do no crime anymore. Decades in prison, they already decided. If you talk to wardens of prison, they will tell you that these juvenile offenders who've been in there decades, they rely on these people to run their prisons. When there is an issue, they come to the juvenile offenders, they come to the lifers, and we the ones squash all the things and things. So we prepared when we actually get an opportunity to come out here because we don't have any inkling of doing a crime again.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Waters. Any questions?
I heard the term incorrigibility used earlier, I think by Deborah Lavelle, and I would talk about prosecutor discretion. Is incorrigibility something that they have to prove in a court of law when they're seeking juvenile life without parole? And if so, how do you prove that?
I'm going to repeat the question. So, I mean, for the people in the back. So the question was, is incorrigibility something that prosecutors have to prove in a court of law to achieve these sentences?
So there was some language in the Miller decision, like incorrigibility, like irreparable corruption is some of the other language that was in that decision. And the U.S. Supreme Court has said that doesn't have to be proven. So there's a U.S. Supreme Court case that said this doesn't have to be proven. In Michigan, that is a little less clear. I think, you know, there's the prosecutor bears the burden. They have to, but there's no, I guess, magic words that the judge has to say about irreparable corruption or something like that. And so it's possible that a sentence could be upheld without those magic words.
What does it mean?
But that's the question, right? So the courts have not given any rational description of what that really means, right? And so it's sort of a language that is talismanic, used or not used, but it doesn't have a lot of meaning. I guess is to answer your question.
Yes.
It's just
Go ahead.
impossible. I mean, it's impossible to say that, you know, looking at someone, for example, who had just committed a crime at 15, how do you say you're irreparably corrupt? Do you say we don't believe in redemption? Do we not believe in change or growth? And do I have some ability to see toward the future? So, you know, it's an absurdism, but it's what people have hung on to when crimes are very rough, for them to say, well, only, this is the only way the judges do it, they say, only a person who would, you know, only someone who is capable of committing this type of crime, they must be irreparably corrupt. So they're not looking to what their capability is in the future. And that's really how it comes down. It's looking at a crime and determining whether that crime in that judge's mind at that time is, or that prosecutor is such of a nature that you would have to be, you know, a devil to commit.
In the back? Go ahead.
Hi.
Hey, yes.
I'm Ariana. Thank you all for sharing your evening with us. I'm deeply inspired by each of you and your work. I've been thinking this is sort of heading into abolition territory, and so hopefully that's cool with this crowd. If not, it's all right too. But I've been just sitting with the stories of sort of that show that incarceration and the conditions of incarceration are often perpetuating, or even in many cases creating sort of the violence that we're kind of preemptively deciding leads people to be incarcerated, but actually, you know, from stories that you've shared, it's people that aren't posing threats to their society or community at all are falling into, being pulled into into the system and then sort of falling into the conditions of violence that prisons or jails perpetuate. And so I'm curious if there's legislation kind of on the table or in the future or in the past that I don't know about that is thinking about like alternatives to incarceration in the first place as sort of a way to, you know, prevent the juveniles and hopefully everyone, but who's sort of struggling with the conditions of violence that the prisons themselves create.
So I'll take a swing at it, since you said the word legislation and I mean, look, we could get into a really fun conversation that would ultimately boil down to semantics, you know, with some of these labels that we like to use in academia, right? But just to try to get to your question, is there legislation, is there talk? When I think about these things, where I put my focus is on ending the war on drugs. I think that there are a lot of different entry points for this, and some folks just want to like enter the whole thing and say we shouldn't have a carceral system or a criminal justice system at all, or you know, there's all sorts of different ways to attack this. But the way that I have attacked it is by saying, here is one problem in our country. We have this massive, expensive, disastrous, failed policy that punctuates the terrible relationships we have between police and community, that punctuates the terrible problems we have with racism, that leads to, more than anything else, mass incarceration, that leads to, more than anything else, the surveillance and police state that many of us worry about. So that's why what I've done is I've tried to attack that. And I've tried to consistently throughout my, you know, years of being an elected official, you know, going back to the 90s, have just said, we need to end the war on drugs, full stop. But then also, you know, hey, how can we do that? Let's work on it, right? Because we got a long ways to go. We got a long ways to go if that's our goal. You may have noticed that a few years ago, a number of us got together and said, maybe a good place to start would be cannabis, because here's something that a lot of people have experience with and aren't very likely to fall for the lies of the prohibitionists when it comes to this particular substance. Now we're starting to, I think, move up that chain. And at a certain point, hopefully we can get to the point where we say, let's have a conversation about, as a community, about how we can reduce substance abuse, how we can bring people back into the circle of community, rather than driving them out into a vortex of isolation, addiction, and often crime.
Well, if you're coming at this from an abolitionist lens, I would say, you know, in the language of abolitionists, this is a sort of non-reformist reform. And so, you know, we really, you know, if you want to look at mass incarceration, you can see every issue in mass incarceration in juvenile life without parole, right? It's the charging and sentencing of young people. It's the disproportionate sentencing and imprisonment of people who are people of color and black. There's the use of mandatory minimums, right? It's a mandatory life without parole sentence. There's imposition of life sentences, which is what we've seen driving sort of the aging of the prison population and some of the mass incarceration. There's the unavailability of federal courts as an avenue for relief, for constitutional relief. And so I think it's not the answer to an abolitionist question, but it's a response.
I also think, just briefly, that I think Jeff, Senator Irwin, and Kim, and everyone here understands that although we're talking about juvenile life without parole because it is so core and essential, that what we all know is that our $2 billion, is it $2 billion a year budget for the Corrections Division, which sucks all the money out of the room from education to everything else, is filled with young people. Not just life without parole, but the majority of the prison is filled with people who committed their crimes when they were young. And so if we can start to get at this, if we can get people to pull out an understanding of you know, what we do with youth, how we understand youth, how we understand how people age out of criminality. If we look at Michigan having I think they have the longest maximum sentences in the country right now. That if we start with our youth and pull them out, I I swear we could have at least the prison population, not just for life without parole, but for, you know, getting a 10 to 20 year sentence for unarmed robbery. I mean, the sentences are extreme and bizarre. And so if we could fight for the youth and youth writ largely, we really could move toward a smaller structure and then start, I think, moving toward a kind of abolition.
Well, I think we have time for one last question, so go ahead in the back.
I was just wondering,
Yeah.
I was just wondering, what are ways that like us as undergraduates can get involved in this type of work? Because a lot of this stuff is like graduate level, grad level stuff, but like, all of us are interested in getting involved. So what would you guys suggest?
That's a great question. It was, how can undergraduates get involved?
I think there's actually many ways. I think you guys have the power to really, really make a difference in the state, right? You guys are future judges, prosecutors, you name it, you know. There's a lot of great organizations, like Mr. Sanders mentioned, you know, SADA being one of them. A lot of your students can go and intern in a lot of these places, and just get with the senator, you know what I'm saying, with the senator and help him, and to push this. So I think that you guys have, you know, and what I like about the youth of today, the creativity using with social media, you guys rock when it comes to social media, man, you know what I'm saying? And so I think just using all forms of media to get the message out that this has to be done, you know what I'm saying? That this has to change, and it's going to be your voices that they're going to help elevate that. So I think you guys actually can do a lot to help that effort.
Can they contact you at the campaign?
Yeah, you can always contact me. Like I said, I just started this position, so I would definitely going to be looking for some help. So at the campaign for the fair sense of youth, yeah, get a hold of me. I guarantee I'll find a way that you can get involved for sure.
I am applying to become a field director for school. I am applying to and have my organization become a field placement for U of M students through school of social work. But I will also make mention, there's an organization called Movement Attorney, and where there's a young lady that was working with the Detroit Justice Center. She done left to take and focus on her organization that she established, is where attorneys are taking and teaching first-year law students how to become movement attorneys. And this is where attorneys would take and give their legal expertise to organizations and community activists, and they would represent them in their movement. So I would encourage you guys, go on the internet and look up the term movement attorney. And this is a new idea and a concept. They're actually taking and providing scholarships and everything, and providing young people with training around this. It kind of goes back to, you remember back in the 60s when you had Thurgood Marshall and other attorneys was representing, like Deborah LaBelle, this is a movement attorney. People like this that's taking and lending their expertise to movements. Without her, our movement we would still be in prison probably. Here in Michigan, what you've seen, what's his name? The attorney, Brian Stevens. What Brian Stevenson done, so there's a lot that you guys can do, and thank you.
On your way out, make sure you grab one of these packets here from the Campaign for Fair Sentencing. That'll give you some information about legislation, about how to sign up. I would just say be a joiner, right? Get on their email list. Get on the ACLU's email list. Get on my email list. Follow me on Twitter or TikTok, right? And just start to get on these lists, join these organizations either as like a full member or just somebody who's listening, and actually read their stuff and take the actions that they're suggesting if they make sense to you. Because the reality is that there are very few people in the community that actually involve themselves in community affairs. And so don't negotiate against your power because you're an undergraduate. You've got the tools and the skills and the intelligence to contribute right now, And if you sign up for these things and you read these things and you become a joiner, you will grow in your skills, knowledge, and experience and capacity to affect these systems.
So I don't want to give myself the last word, but I will say there's many ways to get involved and joining all these groups. But one thing you can do as an undergrad is get involved with the Carceral State Project. We have a series of lab classes that are based on the law clinic model that law school students can get involved in. We've had more than 250 undergraduates writing asylum briefs for clients of the Michigan Immigrants' Rights Center. Students in my class are researching and drafting mitigation memos for juvenile lifers who are coming up for resentencing based on the Miller factors. We've created the largest database of police violence and homicides that exists for any American city around Detroit. Heather Thompson's projects are digging into the conditions of confinement in jails and prisons around the state of Michigan. And I'm working with community groups and impacted people to bring that to the surface. So there's a lot of ways to get involved, but the Carceral State Project did sponsor this event, and if you're interested in getting involved through your coursework and through paid internships, there's ways that you can do that even as you take classes and actively learn. I want to thank the panel. This has been really a wonderful event. Thank you. Thank you for coming out on a Monday evening. It's great to see you all.